In March 1932, a man shot himself in a Paris apartment. He wore a gray suit. The pistol was small. He left no note. Within 48 hours, the New York Stock Exchange lost $50 million in a single afternoon. Banks in Stockholm froze their operations. The French government called an emergency session of parliament, and 600,000 ordinary Swedish citizens discovered their life savings had vanished overnight. The man's name was Ivar Kreuger. Most people today have never heard of him. The institutions responsible for policing the financial system he dismantled worked hard to ensure his story stayed buried. But it did not stay buried, because the U.S. Senate dragged it into the light in 1932, document by document, witness by witness, in one of the most consequential fraud investigations in American history. And what investigators found rewrote the rules of global finance forever. This is the story of a man who fooled Wall Street for 15 years, forged the bonds of foreign governments, with his own hand bribed ministers across 15 countries, built an empire stretching across 34 nations from a small Swedish coastal town, and whose collapse directly produced the laws governing every stock market on Earth today. Welcome to Noob Historian. Behind every headline in your history book, there's a ledger they kept hidden. We open it. Ivar Kreuger was born in 1880 in Kalmar, a small coastal city in southern Sweden. His father ran a match factory. This detail matters more than it first appears. Sweden in the 1880s was not a financial powerhouse. It sat at the edge of European industrial development, exporting timber, iron ore, and matches. The match industry was unglamorous and brutally competitive, depended on cheap phosphorus and cheap labor, fought over by dozens of small regional manufacturers who undercut each other into permanent poverty. Kreuger watched this chaos from childhood. He watched his father struggle against competitors, and he drew a conclusion early. The path to wealth was not competition. It was monopoly. He studied engineering in Stockholm and graduated with distinction. He then left Sweden entirely, spending his 20s working construction projects across the United States, South Africa, and Germany. He built drainage systems in New Jersey. He worked on steel frame buildings in New York. He absorbed American business culture at precisely the moment it was inventing the modern corporation. He returned to Sweden in 1908 at the age of 27 with nothing significant to his name except an extraordinarily clear picture of what he intended to build. He partnered with Paul Toll, a construction engineer, and formed Kreuger and Toll in 1908. The company's initial business was construction, but Kreuger had no long-term interest in building houses. He had his eye on matches. By 1913, Kreuger had consolidated the Swedish match industry through a series of mergers and acquisitions, financed partly by real profits and partly by loans. He formed Swedish Match in 1917 by combining the largest Swedish producers into a single entity. Swedish Match was real. It manufactured and sold matches across dozens of markets. Its operations were legitimate. You need to understand this clearly because the legitimacy of Swedish Match was the foundation on which Kreuger built everything else. A fraud built on nothing collapses immediately. A fraud built on something real survives for 15 years. The key mechanism Kreuger identified in 1918 was the post-World War I financial crisis afflicting European governments. The war had been expensive. Germany owed reparations. France had borrowed heavily from Britain. Poland, Romania, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Greece, and a dozen others were newly formed states with no credit history and desperate need for capital to build infrastructure, pay civil servants, and stabilize their currencies. International banks were willing to lend, but at punishing rates and with stringent conditions. Kreuger offered something different. He approached the governments of small, financially desperate nations with a proposition. He would give them a loan at below-market rates, no collateral required, structured on terms favorable to the borrower. In exchange, they would grant Swedish Match the exclusive legal right to sell matches within their borders for a fixed number of years, typically 20 to 25. This was brilliant for three reasons. First, it was genuinely attractive to the borrowing governments. They got cash without surrendering sovereignty over territory or natural resources. A match monopoly seemed like a small price. Second, it gave Swedish Match a guaranteed revenue stream in each country, flowing into Kreuger's accounts for decades and completely insulated from competition. Third, and most crucially, it gave Kreuger an asset he could show to investors in New York and London. He was not asking them to trust a match company. He was asking them to invest in a portfolio of sovereign-backed revenue streams, guaranteed by national governments and secured by legal monopoly rights. It sounded like something between a government bond and an infrastructure investment. By 1929, Kreuger had signed monopoly agreements with 15 countries, including France, Germany, Poland, Yugoslavia, Romania, Greece, Hungary, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Turkey. He had lent governments a combined total of approximately $400 million. In exchange, Swedish Match collected match revenues across entire national economies. Wall Street loved him. Lee, Higginson and Company, one of Boston's most prestigious investment banks, became his primary American underwriter. They sold Kreuger and Toll securities to retail investors across the United States. The securities paid dividends of 20 to 25% annually. This was the 1920s, the decade of American financial exuberance, and a 25% return backed by sovereign governments sounded like the safest high-yield investment imaginable. The American press called Kreuger the most trusted man in the world. Time magazine ran his portrait on its cover. Herbert Hoover met with him personally. The president of France received him at the Élysée Palace. He owned apartments in Stockholm, Paris, and New York. He ate alone. He spoke to almost no one about the details of his finances. He described this habit as competitive necessity. He told his bankers that revealing the terms of his government deals would allow competitors to undercut him. His bankers accepted this explanation and asked no further questions. This was not naivety. This was a choice. And it is the choice the U.S. Senate would spend years investigating. To understand Ivar Kreuger's fraud, you need to understand the structure he built, because the structure was the fraud. It was not a simple scheme of false invoices or stolen cash. It was an architectural system designed to make lies look like accounting entries and to ensure no single person ever held enough information to see the whole picture. Kreuger controlled approximately 400 separate companies at the peak of his empire. Some were match manufacturers. Some were real estate holding companies. Some were banks. Some were paper entities with no employees, no offices, and no operations. They existed solely to move money between Kreuger's other entities in ways appearing, on paper, as legitimate revenue. The system worked as follows. Swedish Match was the crown jewel and the one genuinely profitable business in the entire empire. It made real matches, sold them in real markets, and generated real cash. But the cash Swedish Match generated was not nearly enough to pay the 20 to 25% dividends Kreuger had promised American investors. To cover the gap, Kreuger created subsidiary companies in multiple jurisdictions, primarily the Netherlands, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland, where corporate disclosure laws were minimal. These subsidiaries would lend money to each other, and those intercompany loans would appear on Kreuger and Toll's consolidated accounts as external revenue. An auditor looking at the consolidated accounts would see income flowing in from dozens of sources. The auditor would not see, without examining each subsidiary's individual records, the money was Kreuger and Toll lending money to itself. This technique is known today as circular lending. It is explicitly illegal under modern securities law. In 1925, it was not illegal anywhere in the world because no laws governed international corporate disclosure standards. Kreuger did not invent the technique, but he deployed it at a scale no one had previously attempted. The second layer of the fraud addressed a different problem. The intercompany loans satisfied investors who looked at revenue figures, but they did not satisfy more sophisticated analysts at Lee. Higginson, who occasionally asked Kreuger to demonstrate his government loan agreements, generated the revenues he claimed. Kreuger's solution was the Italian account. In 1925, Kreuger informed Lee, Higginson, he had reached a confidential agreement with the Italian government of Benito Mussolini. Under this agreement, he claimed, Swedish Match had lent the Italian government $90 million, and in return, Italy had granted Swedish Match the exclusive right to sell matches across the entire Italian peninsula. Kreuger presented this as a particularly valuable asset because Italy's population was large, its match consumption high, and Mussolini's government too authoritarian to ever default on its obligations. The Italian deal was a fabrication. No agreement existed. No loan had been made. The Italian government had received nothing from Swedish Match and had granted nothing in return. The entire asset sat in Kreuger's accounts as fiction. To support the fiction, Kreuger committed the act for which he became historically notorious. He forged Italian government bonds. He obtained blank paper from sources in Stockholm, sat at his private desk, and handwrote $142 million worth of Italian treasury bonds, signing them with the forged names of Italian finance ministers. The bonds were stored in his private vault. When Lee, Higginson occasionally sent representatives to inspect his collateral, Kreuger produced the bonds. The representatives examined them, noted their existence, and reported back to Boston the Italian assets appeared to be in order. No one sent the bonds to the Italian government to verify their authenticity. No one checked them against official records in Rome. Kreuger had structured the meetings so they occurred in Stockholm rather than Italy, and he had cultivated a relationship of trust with Lee Higginson so deep over so many years of profitable business together, the bank's representatives treated his vault as a formality rather than an audit. The third structural element of the fraud was the dual-class share structure Kreuger introduced to Kreuger and Toll in the early 1920s. This is the invention for which he deserves the most attention from modern finance historians and the most blame from modern investors. Kreuger issued two classes of shares in Kreuger and Toll. Class A shares were sold to the public. They paid dividends. They were listed on stock exchanges in New York, Stockholm, London, and Paris. Class B shares were held by Kreuger personally. The critical difference between the two classes was voting rights. Class B shares carried 1,000 times the voting power of Class A shares. This meant Kreuger retained permanent absolute control over every decision made by Kreuger and Toll, regardless of how many Class A shares the public owned. Public shareholders received dividends. They received annual reports. They received the appearance of ownership. What they did not receive was any ability to investigate Kreuger's finances, question his accounting practices, demand external audits, or vote on the composition of the board of directors. This structure is the direct ancestor of the dual-class share structures used today by technology companies, including Google, Meta, and Snap. When founders of modern tech companies issue shares with 10-to-1 voting ratios to maintain personal control, they are using an architecture Ivar Kreuger built in 1923 specifically to prevent investors from discovering his fraud. From 1917 to 1929, the fraud worked. This is the part of the story most financial historians underemphasize, and it matters enormously for understanding how sophisticated fraud operates. Kreuger's empire was not a pure fiction. Swedish Match was genuinely profitable. The government monopoly agreements generated genuine revenue. The construction arm of Kreuger and Toll built real buildings. In years when the genuine businesses performed well, Kreuger needed minimal manipulation to cover the gap between real earnings and promised dividends. The manipulation was concentrated in years when currency shifts, regulatory changes, or market conditions squeezed Swedish Match's margins. The 1920s were, for most of this period, precisely the kind of environment where a partially real financial empire flourished. Global trade expanded throughout the decade. European economies stabilized after the post-war chaos. American investors had money to deploy and an appetite for yield. The stock market climbed year after year. In this environment, a man offering 20% annual returns backed by government monopoly agreements attracted no serious scrutiny because the return seemed expensive but not impossible. Kreuger's genius was social and psychological rather than purely financial. He understood reputation as an asset more durable than any government bond. He cultivated the specific social circles whose endorsement other people trusted. He befriended the right Harvard economists. He dined with the right European finance ministers. He gave carefully calibrated interviews to the right financial journalists. He presented himself as a private, modest man who simply happened to have built the most successful match company in history through operational excellence and diplomatic skill. He maintained this persona through a set of behavioral practices scholars have examined closely since his death. He never celebrated publicly. He discouraged publicity. He declined to discuss his personal wealth. He dressed conservatively and lived outwardly below the level his wealth suggested. He let other people spread stories about his genius and corrected them rarely and gently. This modesty was itself a manipulation. A brash, self-promoting financier attracts scrutiny. A quiet, private man who seems almost embarrassed by his success attracts admiration and protection. His colleagues and bankers felt they were privileged insiders permitted to see behind the curtain of a man the public did not fully appreciate. This feeling of privileged access made them psychologically invested in his success. Lee, Higginson, and Company is the clearest case study in this dynamic. The bank's partners earned enormous fees from Kreuger and Toll underwriting. By the late 1920s, Kreuger and Toll securities represented a significant portion of their revenue. The incentive to believe in Kreuger was financial as well as psychological. When younger analysts at Lee, Higginson raised concerns about the opacity of Kreuger's accounts. Senior partners overruled them. The documentary record from the Pecora hearings shows this explicitly. Partners testified under oath they had received warnings they chose to disregard. The same pattern operated at Price Waterhouse, the firm nominally appointed to audit Kreuger and Toll's accounts. Kreuger gave Price Waterhouse access to the accounts he chose to show them. He compartmentalized his subsidiaries across multiple jurisdictions and presented each auditor with only the accounts relevant to their specific mandate. No single auditor ever saw the consolidated position. Price Waterhouse audited the Swedish operations. A Dutch firm audited the Netherlands holding companies. A German firm audited the German entities. Kreuger coordinated their work to ensure the information flows never overlapped. This is not a failure of auditing in the sense of auditors missing something in plain sight. It is a deliberate structural exploitation of auditing's jurisdictional limitations. In 1928, no international framework for consolidated corporate auditing existed. Kreuger did not need to hide his accounts. He simply needed to ensure each auditor saw only a legitimate slice of a fraudulent whole. The government monopoly agreements were genuine, and Kreuger ensured they were signed and archived in ways he let bankers inspect. The match factories were genuine, and Kreuger ensured their production figures were real and verifiable. The dividends were paid on time, every year, without exception. In the 1920s, an entity paying dividends on time with audited accounts and government-backed assets was by definition creditworthy. The entire system of creditworthiness assessment the financial world relied on assumed the audits were comprehensive and the disclosed assets were all the assets. Kreuger had identified the assumption and exploited it systematically. You need to pause on this point because it explains every major financial fraud since. The system does not fail because fraudsters are cleverer than regulators. The system fails because regulators build rules around disclosed information and sophisticated fraudsters control what gets disclosed. The system depended on one condition above all others. the continuous availability of new capital. Kreuger's empire was, at its core, a rolling refinancing operation. He borrowed money at one rate, promised returns at a higher rate, and covered the gap partly through genuine profits and partly through new borrowing. For this to work indefinitely, two conditions had to hold. New investors had to keep appearing, and existing investors had to keep rolling over their principal, rather than withdrawing it. October 1929 broke both conditions simultaneously. The Wall Street crash of October 1929 did not immediately destroy Kreuger. American investors did not panic sell Kreuger and Toll securities in October 1929, because Kreuger and Toll was not an American technology company or a real estate developer. It was a stable, yield-generating investment backed by sovereign governments. In the immediate aftermath of the crash, investors actually moved money toward Kreuger and Toll because it appeared to be exactly the kind of conservative income-producing asset suitable for a deflationary environment. But the Depression deepened through 1930 and into 1931. Match sales fell across Europe as poverty rose and disposable income contracted. The government monopoly revenues shrank. Swedish Match's genuine profits fell. The gap between what the empire earned and what it owed in dividends widened significantly. And new capital became dramatically harder to raise because American and European investors were liquidating assets to meet margin calls and cover other losses. The decisive blow came from Austria in May 1931. The Kreditanstalt was Austria's largest bank, deeply connected to the financial systems of Germany, Hungary, and the Czech lands. On May 11, 1931, the Kreditanstalt announced its insolvency. The announcement triggered a cascading bank run across Central Europe. Germany suspended payments. Hungary imposed capital controls. The international credit markets froze. Kreuger needed to refinance approximately $50 million of short-term debt in the second half of 1931. In the pre-Depression environment, this would have been routine. After the Kreditanstalt collapse, it was not possible. No bank in Europe or America was willing to roll over significant short-term exposure to any counterparty without first conducting a detailed review of their balance sheet. A detailed review of Kreuger as balance sheet was the one thing Kreuger's entire system was designed to prevent. He managed to keep the machine alive through 1931, through increasingly desperate maneuvers. He sold assets below their value. He borrowed from companies within his own empire, further obscuring his intercompany loan structure. He negotiated delays on dividend payments, explaining them as administrative timing issues. He met personally with the heads of Swedish, French, and American banks and deployed every gram of his formidable social capital to buy time. In the autumn of 1931, he approached the International Telephone and Telegraph Corporation, IT&T, with a proposal to sell a stake in his telecom holdings. IT&T sent its chief financial officer, Donald Ramsey, to Stockholm to examine Kreuger's books as part of the due diligence process. Ramsey was the first external financial professional given access to Kreuger's consolidated position rather than a pre-selected portion of his accounts. Ramsey spent 3 days in Stockholm. He emerged from Kreuger's offices and sent a cable to New York saying, in essence, the books made no sense. The assets claimed by Kreuger and the cash flows documented in his records did not reconcile. Ramsey recommended IT&T walk away from the transaction. IT&T walked away. Within weeks, Swedish banks began refusing to roll over loans. The Swedish government, receiving intelligence from its own finance ministry officials about the state of Kreuger's accounts, began quietly considering whether a formal intervention was necessary. Lee Higginson sent its own representative to Stockholm in early 1932. The representative reported back in language more diplomatic than Ramsey, but carrying the same fundamental message. The accounts were not what Kreuger had represented them to be. In late February 1932, Kreuger traveled to Paris. On March 12th, he dined alone in his apartment on the Avenue Victor Emmanuel. He did not call anyone. He did not write a note. Sometime that morning, he shot himself through the heart. He was 51 years old. His body was found by his secretary at approximately 11 in the morning. Within 4 hours, the news had reached Stockholm. Within 8 hours, it had reached New York. Within 12 hours, every major financial institution in Europe and America was assessing its exposure to Kreuger and Toll. What none of them yet knew was the exposure was far worse than they feared. The death of Ivar Kreuger did not end the crisis. It started it. Within 24 hours of the announcement reaching New York, Kreuger and Toll securities lost 60% of their value on the Stockholm Exchange. American investors holding Kreuger and Toll through Lee Higginson began calling their brokers. Lee Higginson, facing calls it was unable to meet, suspended operations within 2 weeks. The firm, founded in 1848 and one of the oldest and most prestigious investment houses in Boston, never reopened. It ceased to exist because of its exposure to one client. The Swedish government appointed Price Waterhouse to conduct a comprehensive forensic audit. The audit was unprecedented in its scope. Auditors fanned out across 17 countries simultaneously, examining the records of each Kreuger subsidiary in its local jurisdiction, and sharing information across teams for the first time. The consolidated picture took weeks to assemble. What emerged was the 400-page Price Waterhouse Forensic Report of 1932, now held at the Stockholm City Archives. The report cataloged the following. The intercompany loans between Kreuger's subsidiaries were so extensive and so layered, they effectively constituted a separate shadow banking system operating within the corporate shell of Kreuger and Toll. The total volume of circular intercompany lending exceeded the total external debt of the company. The Italian account, the largest single asset on Kreuger and Toll's books, did not exist. The Italian government, contacted by Price Waterhouse investigators, confirmed it had entered into no loan agreement with Swedish Match and had issued no treasury bonds to Kreuger. The $142 million of Italian government bonds stored in Kreuger's private vault were examined and found to be forgeries. Handwriting analysis confirmed Kreuger had written them himself. The signatures of Italian finance ministers were copied from public documents and replicated by hand. The total gap between Kreuger's reported assets and his actual assets was approximately $250 million. Adjusted for inflation, this represents approximately $5 billion in 2024 terms. This was not money taken from accounts and spent elsewhere. It was money listed as assets on documents Kreuger presented to investors and banks, assets invented, maintained through forged paper, and used to justify the continued issuance of securities to the investing public. The Swedish Parliamentary Commission, the Kreugerska Commission, spent 2 years examining how the fraud operated at a political level. Their report, archived at Riksarkivet, documented Kreuger's systematic bribery of government officials across 15 countries. Some officials received cash payments, others received favorable terms on personal investments in Kreuger entities. Several received direct gifts. The Commission found the bribery network was not incidental to the fraud, but structural to it. The government monopoly agreements were the legitimate face of the empire. Officials who received personal benefits from Kreuger were far less likely to conduct the kind of regulatory scrutiny of Swedish Match operations their positions required. The League of Nations Economic Intelligence Service documented the international transmission of the crisis in reports published in 1932 and 1933. The League's analysis showed the Kreuger collapse amplified the ongoing depression in 3 specific ways. First, it destroyed Lee, Higginson, and Company, removing one of the primary channels through which American capital had been flowing into European reconstruction since 1924. This reduction in capital flow hit European borrowers at exactly the moment they were least able to absorb it. Second, the collapse of Kreuger and Toll securities wiped out the savings of 600,000 Swedish retail investors who had been encouraged to buy Kreuger shares through a national marketing campaign Kreuger funded explicitly to broaden his investor base. The destruction of their savings reduced Swedish domestic consumption measurably during 1932 and 1933. Third, and most significantly for the global financial system, the revelation of Kreuger's fraud shattered investor confidence in international corporate securities at precisely the moment the global economy needed investors to move capital back into productive uses. The Pecora hearings in the United States, which investigated Kreuger among several other Wall Street abuses, documented a collapse of retail investor confidence so severe the Senate Banking Committee described it as an emergency threatening the function of American capital markets. Ferdinand Pecora, the Sicilian-American attorney who led the Senate investigation, was characteristically blunt in his testimony summary. He said the financial industry had operated on the assumption investors would not look too closely because looking too closely was too difficult. Kreuger had not beaten a sophisticated system. He had exploited the system's deliberate preference for profitable ignorance. For you as a viewer watching this today, the Pecora hearings are worth understanding not just as historical record, but as a template. Every subsequent congressional investigation into financial fraud, from the savings and loan crisis to Enron to the 2008 mortgage collapse, followed the same basic discovery sequence. The institution was not ignorant. The institution was incentivized to remain ignorant, and ordinary people paid for the resulting fraud with their savings and their livelihoods. The Pecora hearings established this pattern in documentary form. They produced thousands of pages of sworn testimony, all of it publicly available in the National Archives under Record Group 46. Anyone who reads it will find it describes a financial culture indistinguishable in its essential logic from the one in operation today. The United States Congress passed the Securities Act of 1933 on May 27, 1933. It passed the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 on June 6, 1934. Together, these 2 pieces of legislation created the modern framework for securities regulation in the United States and served as the template for securities law in every major economy on Earth. Both laws were written with explicit reference to the Kreuger case in the congressional record. Legislators named Kreuger and Toll in committee debates. They named Lee, Higginson. They named Price, Waterhouse. The specific provisions of the 1933 Act traced directly to specific failures the Pecora investigation documented. This is not interpretation or inference. It is stated plainly in the legislative history, and the legislative history is publicly available at the Library of Congress. The mandatory disclosure requirements of the 1933 Act addressed the fundamental problem of Kreuger's system. Before 1933, companies issuing securities to the American public were not required to file comprehensive audited financial statements with any government authority. They were required to provide investors with whatever information they chose to provide. Kreuger had chosen to provide investors with an annual report, an auditor's letter from Price Waterhouse covering only the portions of his accounts he selected for audit, and his personal representation of the company's financial health. After 1933, every company selling securities to the American public was required to file a registration statement with what became the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC. The registration statement had to include independently audited financial statements covering all material assets and liabilities. The auditing standards the SEC established required consolidated auditing across all subsidiaries, directly addressing the jurisdictional compartmentalization Kreuger had used to prevent any single auditor from seeing the whole picture. The Securities Exchange Act of 1934 created the SEC itself and established ongoing reporting requirements for publicly traded companies. Companies were required to file quarterly and annual reports on standardized forms, audited by independent accountants, filed with the SEC, and available to the public. The insider trading provisions of the 1934 Act addressed the information asymmetries Kreuger had maintained between himself and his investors. These laws changed American capitalism permanently and, through the influence of American financial markets, changed global capitalism. Every investor in every public company in the world today benefits from disclosure standards whose origin lies in the specific techniques Ivar Kreuger used to conceal his fraud from 1917 to 1932. This is not a minor footnote. It is the central fact of the story. The contemporary relevance of the Kreuger case does not lie in its historical curiosity. It lies in the direct structural lineage between his techniques and instruments used in modern markets. The dual-class share structure Kreuger invented in 1923 appears today in the governance documents of Google, Meta, Lyft, Snap, and Airbnb. When Alphabet went public in 2014, it issued Class A shares with 1 vote each and Class C shares with no votes at all. The founders retained Class B shares with 10 votes each. This is Kreuger's architecture, deployed 90 years later with different share class labels but identical logic. Public investors provide capital, founders retain control, and accountability flows in one direction only. The off-balance sheet vehicle Kreuger pioneered through his 400 subsidiaries appeared in 2001 in Enron's special purpose entities. Enron used legally distinct subsidiaries to move debt off its consolidated balance sheet, exactly as Kreuger had moved intercompany liabilities through his Netherlands and Liechtenstein holding companies. The mechanism was identical. The regulatory framework had changed, but Enron's accountants found the gaps in post-1934 disclosure requirements, the same way Kreuger found the gaps in the pre-1933 absence of requirements. When Enron collapsed, the response was the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, a direct legislative descendant of the 1933 and 1934 acts, tightening exactly the rules Enron's accountants had found insufficient. The sovereign debt intermediation model Kreuger invented, in which private financial actors lend to governments in exchange for regulatory concessions, structures emerging market debt finance today. Infrastructure investors, sovereign wealth fund managers, and private equity firms negotiate with developing country governments for operational licenses, resource extraction rights, and regulatory carve-outs in exchange for financing packages. Legal and financial architecture is more sophisticated than Kreuger's match monopoly agreements. The underlying exchange is identical. What the Kreuger case teaches you is not simply fraud exists or trusted men lie. Every era produces frauds and liars. What makes Kreuger historically significant is the precision with which his case maps the distance between the rules and the reality of financial systems. Kreuger did not break the rules of 1920s finance. He followed them. He filed the reports he was required to file. He engaged the auditors he was expected to engage. He issued the disclosures he was legally obliged to issue. The rules of 1920s finance were simply not designed to prevent what he did, because they were designed by people who assumed participants in the financial system shared a basic commitment to the system's integrity. Ferdinand Pecora knew better. In his memoir published in 1939, Pecora wrote, "The financial system did not require more trust. It required fewer reasons to trust and more mechanisms to verify." The difference between trust and verification is the difference between the securities markets of 1929 and the securities markets of 1934. Your savings today are protected by rules written because of one man sitting at a desk in Stockholm forging Italian treasury bonds with his own hand, in the belief no one would ever check. Someone eventually checked. And the someone who checks next time will find, as investigators always find, the rules are one crisis behind the people who profit from ignoring them. That is Ivar Kreuger's most durable legacy. not the fraud, not the forgeries, not the empire of matches and monopolies spread across 34 countries. His most durable legacy is the regulatory framework his collapse made politically possible, and the question his story leaves permanently open. In the years since those frameworks were built, how many people have been sitting quietly at their desks, signing names that are not theirs,